Hi, thanks so much for joining us. I can't imagine that there are people, particularly in Omaha, who don't know who you are, but for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, just a quick bit of background as a form of my welcome and gratitude for taking time with us. We are speaking today with Thomas Warren, who has been serving Omaha for decades. He had a stellar and distinctive 24-year career at the Omaha Police Department, which included, in the last 4 years, Omaha's first Black chief of police. And under his leadership, Omaha Police Department improved police community relations. You were responsible for enhancing the professional image of the department, and I have it on good word that you reduced the overall crime rate in Omaha for 4 consecutive years as well. And then that wasn't enough. So after you were finished with that part of your distinctive career, you decided to, in your retirement, take over the Urban League of Nebraska as its CEO. And since coming to the Urban League, you've revitalized the civil rights organization that is part of a national network, but revitalized it here and ensuring that the voice and fight for social justice in Omaha and the state of Nebraska continues unabated and is amplified. So we are, as Lutheran Family Services, delighted to be in partnership with you as the head of the Urban League, and the Urban League, which administers programs in education, youth development, employment, career services, and violence prevention. So I know, Tom, how busy you are, and in my very short tenure in Omaha, have really appreciated your welcome and your invitation to always be available for conversations, to even work with our board on a number of things as we were heading into our strategic plan. So not only a thanks for your time today, but a thanks for the partnership with Lutheran Family Services and your willingness to talk now. So, you know, these kinds of conversations, as you know, and as we've gotten to talk briefly over a couple of times, are a part of our strategic plan that we call Ambition 2024. So Lutheran Family Services is looking in this next phase of its life to be a better partner in ways that we haven't before, perhaps more relational, less transactional than we've been accustomed to, as many health and human services have been. But given the events of the last couple of weeks, we thought it would be good to begin these conversations a little sooner in our new strategic plan rather than later. And so I'm delighted that you're willing to talk about kind of what's going on in the US and some of the responses that we might have together as organizations that serve Greater Nebraska and Omaha in particular. So I would love to hear from you some of your reflections as to kind of point in time that we are in this history, and then my hope is that we can talk about how we can be better allies and then the joint work that we have together.
Well, thank you, Stacy. And as you mentioned, the Urban League of Nebraska and Lutheran Family Services, we've had a long partnership. The partnership and collaborative effort that we have here with the North Omaha Center for Healthy Families has really been an opportunity to provide direct services to residents and your constituents in our community. And so we've certainly appreciated the ongoing partnership and the support. Obviously, we are dealing with some uncertain times and kind of uncharted waters and precedents, not only in dealing with the pandemic and the public health crises caused by COVID-19, but certainly in terms of this most recent series of events regarding the incident in Minneapolis involving the death of George Floyd, and even locally with some of the civil unrest that we've experienced, culminating in the very tragic death of James Scurlock. But we've seen multiple events around the country. We've seen the controversy mushroom to a national crisis, but there's been a common narrative, and the narrative has been unarmed African-American male. In some instances, at least in the instance of George Floyd, a relatively minor offense, not a deadly force confrontation where, you know, the officer is experiencing any threat or danger that leads to a death. And that is where, you know, as a former law enforcement executive, it's always bothered me, the inability to de-escalate these situations, the inability to, you know, have interpersonal communication skills to assess, you know, okay, if there's a bit of a struggle, let's pause. You know, there's nothing immediate about this situation. There's no danger. Let's collect ourselves and then let's get voluntary cooperation. So that's the incident from a law enforcement perspective. But what has occurred, particularly with the civil unrest, is just as troubling. I certainly believe in free speech, and you have to uphold the right to assemble and exercise that First Amendment right. But as the protests have gotten larger and gotten more confrontational, they're no longer lawful assemblies. And so what may start out as a peaceful demonstration, particularly as it goes on into the evening hours, you tend to see it deteriorate into an unlawful assembly. And then that's when you start having confrontations with law enforcement, as well as the instances where the National Guard has been deployed, as well as destruction of property. And when that occurs, that distracts from, you know, the message and the intent of those respective assemblies. And in my opinion, they're counterproductive.
Thanks so much for that. You'll have to forgive the background noise. My neighbor's mowing, I think, ahead of the rain. So I have been getting a lot of questions, and I've been in conversation with not only staff colleagues at LFS this week, but friends and loved ones around the country and across the world. And, you know, there's been a lot of questions about, so if this is, to your point, excuse me, protests that none of us have experienced before, from where you sit in your perspective, do you think this momentum is going to carry forth? And if so, how can we make more progress in the white community to counter the systems at play, the privileges at play, and all of those pieces that have been part of how Lutheran Family Services as a health and human service organization has contributed to the status quo, so that we can pivot and not only do service work for and with individuals and communities, but really help as a problem-solving organization move the needle in the direction toward equity for all. I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. A couple of observations. One, in terms of when you look at the composition of the demonstrations, and when you see the diversity in the population, those protesters has been very, very diverse. The demographics from age, race, gender, ethnicity, and then, of course, it appears to be younger or youthful protesters. I would put them in Generation Z. And so we're talking about an under 25 demographic that have had their lives interrupted by virtue of COVID, from high school graduations to summer activities and summer programming for college students. Not only those who would be graduating and entering into the workforce, the economy's been disrupted, but even for those upperclassmen who will be looking for internships and other opportunities for employment, not necessarily being available. And so the observation in terms of that population, that demographic of Gen Zs, how can we engage them in a constructive dialogue that it will take in order to come to some resolution? And then to create an environment or a platform or space for meaningful discussions, not necessarily where you're protesting or you're yelling or you're chanting or you're having confrontations with law enforcement or authority, but a platform or forum where you can engage in meaningful, authentic dialogue on the issues. And that would take the ability to identify those emerging leaders, whether it's in your place of employment, or a program participant or a client, those that may be engaged or interested in working on identifying solutions. And then to, what is the grievance? What is the ask? What is the issue? Because when you talk about police community relations, that's an issue that triggered the national crises. And then I say that the demonstrations. But it appears to me that that's symptomatic of the underlying issues of poverty and inequity and institutional racism and those causal issues, the structural issues that unfortunately lead to the aftermath of the situation that we're dealing with. So I think, it's important to identify those root cause issues that contribute to the conditions, where the social economic conditions that we're dealing with, and then look to see where we can have the greatest impact, whether it's employment or education, certainly police community relations. And there's been quite a bit of progress made, at least locally, in my opinion, with improving police community relations. Generally speaking, in the city of Omaha, we have favorable police community relations within our minority communities. And a lot of work has been done. And so my fear or frustration is that I would hate to see all of that hard work go to waste. And so where, we've attempted to address poverty, this very complex social and economic phenomena, we have made progress where our poverty rate was down, the unemployment rate was down. But the fact is, we could be looking at a 20% unemployment rate as a result of COVID. And so recognizing that we've done it before, that, we have strategies that have worked. I think there's interest amongst our leadership, elected, appointed, corporate leadership, those that represent community-based organizations or nonprofit agencies. We would need to work collectively to address these issues, particularly the inequities and the disparities. But more importantly, I think we need to include the voice of that Generation Z. And you hear the outcry, you see the passion. I think we have to find a mechanism to enlist them into the conversation in a genuine and authentic manner.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what I really appreciate about your response is that emphasis on listening. And as I have not experienced, but seen and have come to an understanding of, is that listening has been a piece of the work, particularly in health and human services, that we've not done a great job of historically doing. We're really good at trying to fit people into services rather than working through and listening and figuring out what services are actually needed to make those changes. And so I wonder, as we kind of wrap up this interview, I know how busy you are, but I wonder if you would be willing to offer some advice to organizations on how to better listen, how to better engage in ways that are authentic, so that we can glean the wisdom of Gen Z and every other voice that tends to either have been marginalized or hasn't been taken as seriously, and what are the things that we need to be doing in concert with great organizations like the Urban League to move forward. I mean, as our staff have been dipping our toes into some collective learnings around how institutional racism has worked historically and some of where it continues to, and the long shadow of racism in housing, redlining, GI Bill, that sort of thing. Besides attending to the history that brought us here, how best can we listen today?
And that's an important place to start, because oftentimes well-intended individuals, they don't have the depth of knowledge or familiar with the history that has contributed to the circumstances that we're dealing with. I had an opportunity to participate in a series of workshops, seminars presented by the Racial Equity Institute here recently, within the last year. And for someone who considers themselves fairly well versed on the history of race in the United States, it was very, very enlightening. And so I think, it's important to educate oneself on the history of redlining, the history of what has contributed to the mass incarceration of people of color. Look even locally, because the city of Omaha has a relatively interesting history when it comes to race relations. And take a time that, the book 24th and Glory, I would recommend. It's kind of a sports themed book. However, it also chronicles the history of race relations in the city of Omaha. Very, very well written. Dirk Charlton from Omaha World published it and has actually received some national recognition. But as an organization, as I mentioned, whether you have staff or clients or program participants that are interested in having dialogue around these important issues, to be able to create a forum within your organization. Of course, now with COVID, it may have to be virtual. So it's not a situation where you necessarily would have to convene, but to have a means to potentially have a virtual conversation on these topics, and whether it's use of force, or whether it's the grand jury process, or these topics that are relevant and immediate today, I think it would be worthwhile for those individuals that have an interest to engage in those conversations and be deliberate in terms of identifying individuals from Generation Z to participate and to maybe lead the conversations.
Yeah. Well, I know that you've got a million other things to do, so I really appreciate you taking the time. And I've done a lot of the question asking, so I don't know if there are any questions you have for Lutheran Family Services as we continue.
And again, if you have any ideas on opportunities for collaboration, certainly we're interested. We have space available, but again, we may have to do it virtually. I've appreciated our partnership. Stacy, I know that we welcomed you to our community. I imagine you're settled in by now, but if there's anything we can do on our end to assist in improving not only service delivery, but ultimately we want to have that lived experience to improve for the people whom we serve.
That's exactly right. Well, thank you so much. I felt the warm welcome, and it's extended into my entire tenure here. And I really look forward to not only the continued conversation, but the work ahead. And I would extend the same to the Urban League. We are always ready to assist, knowing that we need to assist with all humility and realizing we don't have the answers, but we do have willing hands and feet. So thank you so much for everything.
You're very welcome.
Stay safe and healthy, and best to you and yours.
Okay, take care.
Thanks.